Our next reading is from the book of John, chapter 19, verses 17 to 42. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the 2 of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there.
Through the hymns and the spoken word of Scripture, we have heard a lot already today. And I hope and pray that perhaps your heart is drawn to reflect deeply of God's presence and God's grace in the midst of this day. Perhaps, even as you listen, you might take the paper and write some of those thoughts as prayers or as questions, something that you might lay before the cross. And at the time after the sermon, there will be a 5-minute kind of silence, silence for us, but we will sing repeatedly over that time while you reflect and while you write something on the paper, if you wish to do that. At that time, then you will be invited to come and place it at the cross and return to your seat. But now, I bring these thoughts that have been prepared by others. And while there's much of what, the reason I've chosen to hold that intact for you today, is because I really think it gives us a whole nother perspective, a different way of hearing a message that's vital to us on Good Friday. So there's a few things right at the beginning here that I didn't write this, someone else did. It was their issue about whether it's easy or not to write a sermon for Good Friday and Easter Sunday. But it leads us into some thoughtfulness. Believe it or not, a Good Friday sermon is usually easy to tackle. At least it's easier than Easter Sunday. The themes of Good Friday, betrayal, anguish, grief, terror, failure, are all known to us. They can be easier to believe than the hope and the impossible new life of Easter Sunday. But this passage from John's Gospel is not at all easy. It's not because of John's theology. It's because of John's language. It's because John, far from Matthew, Mark, Luke combined, mentioned a group of people whose name in English gets translated as the Jews. And we, unlike John's first hearers, live in a world in which Jewish people have been, over the last 2,000 years, have been excluded, expelled, harassed, attacked, and killed in the name of the one who goes to the cross. We still live in this world today. John's text bears a weight that it was never meant to bear. Historically, it was often the reading of these two very chapters that we've read today that caused Jewish communities to lock their doors and hide on Good Friday, trying to keep themselves safe from raging mobs that would spill out of church services in which these words were read, looking for some Jews to assault. Many scholars argue that the Greek words we translate as the Jews should in fact be translated as the Judeans. Religion and ethnicity, they argue, weren't separate identities for John in the way that we separate them now. The people of a region and the people of a faith were the same. There is a lot to be said for this argument, and yet in our everyday lives we have Bibles in our homes and churches whose pages say the Jews. Almost just even saying it feels a bit like a direct word that should not be spoken in that tone. We live in a world in which Christians on every continent still believe our Jewish neighbors are responsible for the death of Jesus. I put a note in there, not everyone believes that. It's important for us to hear that as well. But we know we live in a contentious world, and a world is getting more and more direct in how things are being said, no matter how destructive they might be. The term Christ killer is not confined to history, and so we need to name and grapple with these things in our day-to-day. Beyond the unspeakable suffering, including the Shoah, that Christian institutions and people have visited upon Jews, the tragedy of this reality is that John's telling of this story was never meant to be assigning blame. John's gospel has been and is weaponized in a way that misreads the text and loses John's point. John's telling of the arrest, trial, crucifixion, and burial of Jesus never assigns blame to any person or group. Instead, John is very clear. Jesus chooses this for himself. That statement in itself is significant for us to pause on this day to think about. The Jesus of John's gospel is no victim. He does not pray anguished and alone in the garden. There are no jeering bystanders in John's telling. This Jesus does not cry out his abandonment from the cross. John's Jesus shows neither fear nor pain. Not because he's a superhero who doesn't feel anything, but because of John, Jesus is in control the whole time. The death is a fulfillment of what Jesus has come to do in a way that none of Jesus' enemies can understand. This is the hour in which the kingship that they mock and scorn is actually on full display as a contrast to worldly power. Why? How? Why would Jesus come just to die? What's the point of that? And what about any of this makes Jesus a king? So let's wrestle with these questions a little bit. In John's theology, Jesus has come to reveal the fullness of God. Everything he does, whether it's turning water into wine, raising Lazarus from the dead, or walking on water, points back to God. Everything this Jesus does is and says is revealing of God. It's like John wants Jesus to have a neon sign above his head blinking the word God. Everything this Jesus does is and says is an invitation, a question, a challenge. Will we trust the living God for which Jesus is a walking billboard? It's strange language for us, I know it is. And it's not language that we might like to hang on to, but it just makes a point. It opens up a new way of thinking, of seeing something in a different light. This is not the same as asking us to believe without question or doubt. Trust ebbs and flows. It's vulnerable, but it's also life-changing. Are we, Jesus asks, going to trust God or not? That's what this day is asking us. Every one of us has days, times, seasons in which our answer is much more on the not side of things. Trusting Jesus is not an unthinking belief that everything will be okay. Good Friday is about naming how often things are not okay. Trusting God